It was just another day at the airport for Officer Dan Carter. The noise of hundreds of travelers filled the air, a mix of excited voices and hurried footsteps. Dan had seen it all in his 10 years as an airport security officer. Long lines of people waiting to check in, delayed flights that made tempers flare, and frustrated families trying to get through the checkpoints. He had watched people argue over bags, seen parents struggle with crying children, and even dealt with an occasional drunk passenger who had crossed the line. But despite the chaos, Dan was calm. He knew how to handle it all. That was his job. It had become routine. Every day felt the same. Dan walked his usual patrol route, scanning the faces in the crowd, making sure everyone was following the rules. He stood at his post near security, his eyes moving from person to person, keeping an eye out for anything unusual. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble often found its way to him. He was good at his job, but he didn't care about fame or recognition. His paycheck was what mattered, and that was enough for him. The outside world, the big stories on the news, seemed so far away from the small, often dull life of airport security. That morning, however, something felt different. It wasn't the usual rush of passengers or the typical holiday travel madness. It was something subtle, something in the air. Dan couldn't put his finger on it. Maybe it was just the stress of working the early shift, or maybe it was the endless wait for something exciting to happen. Whatever it was, Dan felt an unease deep in his gut. But he wasn't one to let small feelings bother him. He pushed the sensation aside, telling himself it was nothing. He'd been through worse. The security line ahead of him was bustling with passengers. Some were stressed, others were calm, but all were moving in the same direction. Dan observed each person. He was always on the lookout for anything out of place. A traveler who looked too nervous. Someone acting strangely. But as he stood there, the usual patterns of behavior seemed almost too ordinary. Nothing stood out. That's when he saw him. A man in a sharp, black suit was standing in the security line. He looked perfectly normal. He was just like the hundreds of other businessmen who passed through the airport every day. His hair was neatly combed, his face calm, and his eyes were focused on the path ahead. There was nothing special about him at first glance, yet something about him caught Dan's attention. The man had a quiet confidence, an air of stillness that seemed to separate him from the rest of the crowd. Most people in the line looked hurried, their eyes darting back and forth, their minds preoccupied with thoughts of missed flights or upcoming meetings. But this man, he stood still, like he was part of the background, watching everything without moving a muscle. His hands were folded in front of him, and his expression was calm, almost too calm. Dan was trained to notice small details, and this man's behavior didn't sit right. There was something about the way he held himself, the way he moved so deliberately and slowly. Dan couldn't quite explain it. Maybe it was just the stress of the job or the long hours, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man than met the eye. He looked at the man again, trying to get a better sense of who he was. The man's face was ordinary, like the thousands of other faces Dan had seen. There was nothing remarkable about it, no strange features, no unusual expressions. But for some reason, Dan's instincts told him to pay attention. His eyes scanned the man's movements, every little gesture. His clothes, though expensive looking, didn't seem out of place for someone who could afford a private jet. His shoes were polished to a shine, his suit crisp and perfectly tailored. There was no hint of nervousness, no glint of fear in his eyes. But that didn't make sense to Dan. People were always a little nervous at airports, especially in security lines. As the man moved forward, Dan's eyes followed him. The man didn't rush. He wasn't trying to cut in front or show any impatience. He just walked, his footsteps measured, his face steady. Dan wondered if he had seen this man before. Maybe he had passed through the airport on other days. But even as he tried to think back, Dan couldn't recall seeing him. The man reached the security checkpoint and placed his bag on the conveyor belt. As he waited for the bag to pass through the scanner, Dan noticed something strange. The man's eyes briefly met Dan's, but there was no flicker of recognition, no sign of acknowledgement. It was as if Dan were invisible. For a moment, it made Dan feel small. As if he were nothing more than a cog in the machine. It wasn't the first time someone had looked past him like that, but this time, it bothered him. Just another businessman, Dan muttered to himself. But deep down, he felt something was wrong. This man, with his calm demeanor and piercing gaze, was not just another businessman. Dan's gut told him that. But what could it be? Why would someone so ordinary-looking draw his attention like this? The thought lingered in his mind, but he quickly pushed it away. The man moved through the scanner without a problem. No alarms. No issues. He didn't seem worried at all. Dan followed the man with his eyes, scanning the area for anything that might stand out. But it was just another day. Another routine. Or so Dan thought. Little did he know, the moment he had just witnessed was about to set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. That ordinary-looking man? He wasn't ordinary at all. He wasn't just another rich businessman. He wasn't someone who could simply pass through the airport unnoticed. No, that man was Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader of North Korea. And he was about to cross paths with Officer Dan Carter in a way neither of them could ever have predicted. As Dan went about his rounds, unaware of the true identity of the man he had just observed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something big. The quiet unease in his chest was growing stronger, gnawing at him. But it was too late to turn back. The story had already begun. It was just another day at the bustling airport for Officer Dan Carter. The noise of hundreds of travelers filled the air, a mix of excited voices and hurried footsteps. Dan had seen it all in his 10 years as an airport security officer. Long lines of people waiting to check in, delayed flights that made tempers flare, and frustrated families trying to get through the checkpoints. He had watched people argue over bags, seen parents struggle with crying children, and even dealt with an occasional drunk passenger who had crossed the line. But despite the chaos, Dan was calm. He knew how to handle it all. That was his job. It had become routine. Every day felt the same. Dan walked his usual patrol route, scanning the faces in the crowd, making sure everyone was following the rules. He stood at his post near security, his eyes moving from person to person, keeping an eye out for anything unusual. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble often found its way to him. He was good at his job, but he didn't care about fame or recognition. His paycheck was what mattered, and that was enough for him. The outside world, the big stories on the news, seemed so far away from the small, often dull life of airport security. That morning, however, something felt different. It wasn't the usual rush of passengers or the typical holiday travel madness. It was something subtle, something in the air. Dan couldn't put his finger on it. Maybe it was just the stress of working the early shift, or maybe it was the endless wait for something exciting to happen. Whatever it was, Dan felt an unease deep in his gut. But he wasn't one to let small feelings bother him. He pushed the sensation aside, telling himself it was nothing. He'd been through worse. The security line ahead of him was bustling with passengers. Some were stressed, others were calm, but all were moving in the same direction. Dan observed each person. He was always on the lookout for anything out of place. A traveler who looked too nervous. Someone acting strangely. But as he stood there, the usual patterns of behavior seemed almost too ordinary. Nothing stood out. That's when he saw him. A man in a sharp, black suit was standing in the security line. He looked perfectly normal. He was just like the hundreds of other businessmen who passed through the airport every day. His hair was neatly combed, his face calm, and his eyes were focused on the path ahead. There was nothing special about him at first glance, yet something about him caught Dan's attention. The man had a quiet confidence, an air of stillness that seemed to separate him from the rest of the crowd. Most people in the line looked hurried, their eyes darting back and forth, their minds preoccupied with thoughts of missed flights or upcoming meetings. But this man, he stood still, like he was part of the background, watching everything without moving a muscle. His hands were folded in front of him, and his expression was calm, almost too calm. Dan was trained to notice small details, and this man's behavior didn't sit right. There was something about the way he held himself, the way he moved so deliberately and slowly. Dan couldn't quite explain it. Maybe it was just the stress of the job or the long hours, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man than met the eye. He looked at the man again, trying to get a better sense of who he was. The man's face was ordinary, like the thousands of other faces Dan had seen. There was nothing remarkable about it, no strange features, no unusual expressions. But for some reason, Dan's instincts told him to pay attention. His eyes scanned the man's movements, every little gesture. His clothes, though expensive looking, didn't seem out of place for someone who could afford a private jet. His shoes were polished to a shine, his suit crisp and perfectly tailored. There was no hint of nervousness, no glint of fear in his eyes. But that didn't make sense to Dan. People were always a little nervous at airports, especially in security lines. As the man moved forward, Dan's eyes followed him. The man didn't rush. He wasn't trying to cut in front or show any impatience. He just walked, his footsteps measured, his face steady. Dan wondered if he had seen this man before. Maybe he had passed through the airport on other days. But even as he tried to think back, Dan couldn't recall seeing him. The man reached the security checkpoint and placed his bag on the conveyor belt. As he waited for the bag to pass through the scanner, Dan noticed something strange. The man's eyes briefly met Dan's, but there was no flicker of recognition, no sign of acknowledgement. It was as if Dan were invisible. For a moment, it made Dan feel small. As if he were nothing more than a cog in the machine. It wasn't the first time someone had looked past him like that, but this time, it bothered him. Just another businessman, Dan muttered to himself. But deep down, he felt something was wrong. This man, with his calm demeanor and piercing gaze, was not just another businessman. Dan's gut told him that. But what could it be? Why would someone so ordinary-looking draw his attention like this? The thought lingered in his mind, but he quickly pushed it away. The man moved through the scanner without a problem. No alarms. No issues. He didn't seem worried at all. Dan followed the man with his eyes, scanning the area for anything that might stand out. But it was just another day. Another routine. Or so Dan thought. Little did he know, the moment he had just witnessed was about to set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. That ordinary-looking man? He wasn't ordinary at all. He wasn't just another rich businessman. He wasn't someone who could simply pass through the airport unnoticed. No, that man was Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader of North Korea. And he was about to cross paths with Officer Dan Carter in a way neither of them could ever have predicted. As Dan went about his rounds, unaware of the true identity of the man he had just observed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something big. The quiet unease in his chest was growing stronger, gnawing at him. But it was too late to turn back. The story had already begun. The minutes passed, and the security line continued to move. People came and went, their lives momentarily intersecting at the airport before they went on their separate ways. Dan kept to his usual routine, walking the perimeter, watching the passengers and staff, and occasionally greeting familiar faces. But the strange encounter from earlier stayed with him. His mind kept returning to the man in the suit. It wasn't just the calmness, the stillness that had unsettled Dan. It was the way the man had moved through the checkpoint like he belonged there, as if the world itself bent to his will. It felt different. Out of place. But what could it mean? It wasn't like Dan to dwell on feelings like this. He wasn't a detective. He wasn't even the kind of guy to question things. He just did his job and went home at the end of the day. But that feeling, that gut feeling, was growing stronger with every passing minute. He glanced at the security monitors above the conveyor belt. Everything was normal. Travelers going through the X-ray machine, bags being inspected, nothing unusual on the screens. Dan sighed, reminding himself that it was just another busy day. He had to focus. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. "Officer Carter, we need you by Gate B," a voice said, cutting through the quiet hum of the terminal. It was the voice of Officer Brown, his partner. "There's been a situation. We need you to come quickly." Dan's heart skipped a beat. A situation? His instincts kicked in. He didn't waste any time. He grabbed his radio and responded, "On my way." He walked quickly to Gate B, the crowd parting before him as he made his way through the airport. It was the first time that day he felt like something was really happening. Something important. When he reached the gate, he was met by Officer Brown and a few other airport staff. Their faces were tense, their expressions grim. Dan immediately knew something serious was going on. "What's happening?" Dan asked, his voice steady. Officer Brown motioned to the area near the jetway. "That man you were watching earlier, the one in the black suit. He's not who he says he is. We just got word from Intel. It's Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader." Dan was the kind of cop who did his job with routine precision. He wasn't the type to seek out trouble, but he didn't shy away from it either. He was used to the constant hum of the airport, the steady stream of passengers, and the normal chaos that came with being on duty. Each day felt similar, but in his line of work, there was always something to watch for. He had learned to trust his instincts, and over the years, those instincts had saved him more times than he could count. His eyes never stopped scanning the crowd, looking for any signs of danger, or any situation that didn't quite feel right. And, at least in this moment, everything seemed normal at first. The airport was crowded as usual. The terminal was bustling with people, rushing past each other, some of them arguing over their luggage, others glued to their phones. Parents with tired children in tow, tourists pulling heavy bags behind them, and business travelers dressed in sharp suits with little time to spare. The noise was almost constant: chatter, the screech of wheels against the floor, and the soft beep of the scanner machines. Dan walked along the edge of the crowd, his boots tapping gently on the tiled floor, the familiar weight of his badge on his chest, a constant reminder of his duty. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and it paid the bills. He was content in his own way, nothing flashy, just getting through the day. But as he passed the security checkpoint and glanced out at the sea of faces, something caught his attention. It wasn't loud or sudden, just a quiet shift in the air. His gaze landed on the man in the sharp black suit who was standing near the check-in desk, his hands clasped together in front of him, his eyes calm, almost too calm. It was a look that stood in stark contrast to the usual flurry of impatient travelers around him. At first, Dan couldn't quite pinpoint what was wrong. There were no obvious signs of trouble. The man wasn't fidgeting or acting strangely, there was no erratic behavior that would trigger any alarms. He wasn't drawing attention to himself at all. And yet, something about him made Dan pause. The man's posture was too still, his movements too controlled, as if he were waiting for something or perhaps, someone. In a place like this, most people were rushing, distracted, and a little anxious. But not this man. His expression was impassive, unreadable. He was waiting in line like anyone else, but his calmness stood out in a way that made Dan's instincts flare up. Dan knew this feeling. It was the feeling he had when something wasn't right, but couldn't yet explain why. It was a deep gut feeling, honed over years of experience. He had seen this before: someone who blended in too well, who made an effort to seem average, but who was anything but. It was the kind of behavior that set off a warning bell in his mind, and despite everything, he couldn't shake the sense that there was more to this man than just an ordinary businessman. His eyes narrowed slightly as he watched the man for a few more moments. Then, as if the man sensed Dan's gaze, his eyes met Dan's just for a second, but it was enough. There was a flicker of something in the man's eyes, a brief shift, almost imperceptible. It wasn't fear, but something else: a cool awareness, as if he knew exactly who was watching him. Dan immediately felt a jolt in his chest. His heart rate increased, and his mind shifted into high gear. He'd seen that look before too. It was the look of someone who was aware of everything around them, someone who was in control, someone who had too much to hide. It was the look that told Dan the man wasn't just another wealthy traveler. No, this man was hiding something. Maybe not in a way that was obvious to the people around him, but there was something that didn't fit. Without thinking twice, Dan made his move. He approached the man swiftly but with a calculated calm. The airport might be a busy place, but this wasn't the kind of situation he could take lightly. He reached the man in a few long strides and placed his hand on his arm. "Excuse me, sir," Dan said, his voice steady but firm. "Can I ask you a few questions?" The man stiffened for a moment, then slowly turned to face Dan. His eyes met Dan's again, but this time, there was no hint of surprise. The man remained perfectly still, like a stone statue, his face as unreadable as ever. "I'm sorry," the man said softly, his voice smooth, but there was an undercurrent of something darker. "I don't know what this is about, officer, but I don't have time for questions right now." Dan's grip tightened slightly on the man's arm. There was something in the man's voice, in his words, that didn't sit right with him. "Just a moment, sir," Dan replied, his tone insistent. "You've been acting unusual. I'd like to ask you to step aside for a moment." The man didn't resist as Dan gently guided him toward a quieter corner of the terminal, away from the rush of people. The man's eyes darted to the left and right, as if weighing his options. But his face remained impassive. Dan kept his focus on him, his training kicking into full gear now. He had dealt with situations like this before: people trying to hide something, trying to slip under the radar. There was always more to it than just a simple misunderstanding. As they moved further away from the crowd, Dan could feel the tension building. He knew the man wasn't going to cooperate. He could sense it in the stiff way the man moved, the subtle way he avoided making direct eye contact for too long. The calmness was unnatural. People didn't act like that when they were innocent. "What's going on?" Dan asked again, his voice low and controlled, but his mind was racing. "Who are you really?" The man's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was almost as if he were amused. "I've already told you, officer. I'm just a businessman." Dan's eyes narrowed. "A businessman doesn't stand out like you do." For a moment, there was silence between them. The man didn't respond, his face still composed and unreadable. Then, just as Dan was about to press further, a voice crackled through the radio at Dan's belt. "Officer Carter," came the voice of his partner, Officer Brown. "We've got some intel. You need to stand down. The man you've got there, he's not who you think he is." Dan's heart skipped a beat. He tightened his grip on the man's arm, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice urgent. "Dan, trust me on this," Officer Brown said. "It's Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea." We've just received confirmation from Intel. Dan froze. The world seemed to slow down around him. His mind raced as the words sunk in. Kim Jong-un? The man in front of him, the man he had just assumed was a businessman, was the supreme leader of North Korea? It didn't make sense. The man didn't look like the image he'd seen on the news. No. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some mistake. But as the realization hit him, Dan's instincts told him it wasn't a mistake. This man, this calm figure standing before him, was far more dangerous than anything Dan had ever encountered. He wasn't just a criminal or a rogue traveler. He was someone who had the power to change the course of history. And Dan had just unknowingly stepped into something that was far beyond his pay grade. The silence stretched between them as Dan processed the information. He glanced at the man again, his mind struggling to make sense of the situation. But there was no time to think. There was no time to second guess. Dan's hand hovered near his radio, his mind racing. What now? How was he supposed to handle this? Kim Jong-un was supposed to be in North Korea, not standing in an airport in the United States. But here he was. The moment Dan touched the man's arm, the air around them seemed to shift. Everything felt heavier, as if time had slowed for just a second. The man didn't flinch. He didn't even twitch. His body stayed still, almost like he was made of stone. But there was something in his eyes, something that made Dan feel uneasy. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something colder, something sharper. It was as if the man knew exactly what was happening, and he wasn't worried in the slightest. Dan didn't like that feeling. In his line of work, being calm under pressure was good, but this was different. This man wasn't just calm, he was too calm. It felt unnatural, like he was playing a role, pretending to be someone else. Is there a problem, officer? The man's voice was steady. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't panicking, he wasn't doing anything that a normal person might do if they were caught off guard. His words were smooth, almost too smooth. Dan blinked, trying to shake off the odd feeling rising in his chest. You don't look like a guy who just wants to catch a flight, Dan said, his voice firm but not aggressive. What's your name? The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a thin, almost sly smile, as if he found something amusing in the situation. It was the kind of smile that made Dan feel like he wasn't in control anymore. I don't think that matters right now, the man said, his voice still calm. He didn't seem bothered by the question at all. He was in complete control, and that made Dan's grip on the man's wrist tighten. It wasn't just about the man's behavior. It was the feeling in the pit of his stomach, the sense that something was wrong. Dan had been around enough to know when something wasn't right. He had a trained eye, and his gut was telling him this man wasn't just some random traveler. He wasn't just someone who had gotten on the wrong side of an airport security guard. No, this man had something more, something dangerous. Not today, Dan muttered under his breath. He wasn't going to let this man walk away, not without answers. He wasn't going to let this feeling go unanswered. But just as Dan started to tighten his grip again, something changed. It wasn't a loud sound or a sudden movement. It was the whispers. At first, they were soft, barely audible. A staff member nearby had started to whisper to a colleague. They were trying to keep it quiet, but it wasn't long before the whispers grew louder. The words were hard to make out at first, but the more people who joined in, the clearer they became. Isn't that him? One staff member murmured. I think it's him, another voice whispered urgently. Then came the most shocking whisper of all, it's Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. Dan's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know what to think. The words didn't make sense at first. Kim Jong-un? The leader of a country on the other side of the world? He had seen the man on the news, of course. But seeing him here? In this airport? Standing right in front of him? It was impossible. His grip faltered for just a second, and that small slip gave the man the opportunity to pull his arm away. The air between them thickened. Dan couldn't breathe properly as the weight of the realization hit him. This man wasn't just any businessman or traveler. He wasn't someone who had accidentally slipped through security. No. This man was Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader of North Korea. The man everyone knew but had never imagined would be standing here, in this very airport. Dan blinked, his mind racing. He knew about Kim Jong-un from the news, from briefings, from the fear that had always surrounded him. This was a man whose decisions affected millions, whose power was as vast as it was dangerous. This was not someone who should be here, not someone who should be standing in an airport in the middle of the United States. The realization hit him like a wave, and suddenly the world around him felt like it was spinning out of control. Kim Jong-un. The man whose very name made governments tremble. The man who was known for his ruthless leadership, his tight grip on power, and his unpredictable nature. And yet, here he was, standing quietly, with no sign of panic or fear, in an airport terminal. How could this happen? How could someone so powerful just appear out of nowhere? Dan's head was spinning. He was trained to handle tough situations, but this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. The truth was so strange, so out of place, that for a moment, Dan wondered if he was imagining it all. But the whispers around him were real. The recognition in the eyes of the airport staff was real. And the man standing in front of him, with his impassive expression, was real. Kim Jong-un was here. A sudden burst of cold fear hit Dan's chest. He had to do something. He had to stop this situation from escalating, from spiraling into something he couldn't control. But how? He was just a cop, a small cog in a huge machine. What was he supposed to do with someone like Kim Jong-un? What was he supposed to do when a figure like that was right in front of him? His thoughts were interrupted when another voice came through his radio, but this time, it wasn't Officer Brown. It was someone higher up. Someone from the intelligence department. "Officer Carter," came the voice, low and urgent. "This is serious. You've just made contact with Kim Jong-un. We've received confirmation from multiple sources. You need to secure the area immediately and make sure he doesn't leave the premises." Dan's body went rigid. His grip on the radio tightened. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, and his mind raced to process the information. He had heard of high-profile security threats before, but this was something else entirely. "Roger that," Dan managed to say, his voice shaking. He had to think quickly. He couldn't let this man slip away. Not now. Not when he knew who he really was. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. There was no room for mistakes. This wasn't a normal arrest. This wasn't a routine situation. He had to handle this carefully, but there was one thing Dan knew for sure: he couldn't let Kim Jong-un walk out of here without proper intervention. The world was watching. The situation was dangerous. There were too many unknowns, too many risks. The tension was thick, like a storm hanging in the air, waiting to explode. Dan could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His every move now had the potential to change the course of history. But before he could make a move, Kim Jong-un's voice cut through the tension. "I think," the man said softly, his tone almost mocking, "it's time you let me go. I'm not the one you think I am." Dan's heart skipped. Was this a trick? Was he trying to throw him off? Or was this the moment Dan needed to act? Before Dan could respond, there was another sudden shift in the crowd. A team of heavily armed security officers rushed past, their faces set with grim determination. They were not here for the usual airport protocol, they were here for Kim Jong-un. They were here to protect him. Dan's mind was spinning, racing in 1,000 directions at once. Everything he thought he knew was falling apart. It had started as just another day at the airport. He was supposed to be watching for trouble, keeping an eye on the passengers, and making sure everything went smoothly. But now, here he was, holding on to the most dangerous man in the world, someone whose name could shake the entire planet. Kim Jong-un. Dan couldn't believe it. His body seemed frozen, like he was watching someone else in this situation. But he knew this wasn't a movie. This wasn't a drill. This was real, and it was happening right in front of him. The man in the suit was still calm. Too calm. In fact, the more Dan looked at him, the more unsettling it became. There was no fear, no panic, no sign that he was the least bit concerned about being caught. It was as if he didn't care at all, and that terrified Dan more than anything else. Dan tried to keep control of the situation. He had to. This was his job, and he couldn't let his emotions take over. He couldn't afford to make a mistake now. The man he was holding wasn't just some random traveler. He wasn't just some wealthy businessman. No, he was the leader of North Korea, someone whose every decision affected millions of people. You don't know who I am, do you? The man's voice broke through the confusion. It was soft, almost casual, but there was something dangerous in it. Something that made Dan's stomach twist. Dan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He couldn't let this man get under his skin. Not now. Not when everything depended on his next move. Who you are doesn't matter. You're coming with me, Dan said, his voice sounding more confident than he felt. The man didn't even blink. Instead, his lips curled into a smile. It wasn't a kind smile. It wasn't a smile that reassured anyone. It was a smile that made Dan feel small, insignificant, like a child trying to play in a world far beyond his understanding. I think you'll find it does matter, officer, the man said, his voice barely above a whisper, but each word felt like a hammer striking Dan's chest. Before Dan could respond, the situation grew even more chaotic. From behind him, he heard the sound of heavy footsteps, and suddenly, several security guards rushed past him, heading straight toward the man in the suit. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear. They weren't just security guards, they were specialists. They were trained for situations like this, but even they were clearly unprepared for what was unfolding. Dan didn't know what to do. His training had never prepared him for this kind of situation. He had never been told how to handle the most dangerous man in the world standing right in front of him. But then the loudspeaker crackled to life, cutting through the noise and confusion. The words that came through sent a chill down Dan's spine. We have a high-level security threat. Get the area secured. Now. The voice on the loudspeaker was calm, but the urgency in it was unmistakable. Dan's heart skipped a beat as the full weight of the situation hit him. This wasn't just a routine arrest. This wasn't just an ordinary mistake. This was something much, much bigger. The man in the suit was Kim Jong-un, and Dan had just placed his hands on him. Officer, one of the security guards said urgently, rushing over to Dan's side. His voice was tight with panic. You need to let him go. Now. This is not a situation you're equipped to handle. Dan turned to face the guard, his face flushed with confusion. What do you mean, let him go? This man is a threat. He's. Listen to me, the guard interrupted, his voice shaking. You don't understand. He's protected. He's untouchable. If you don't release him, you'll be putting us all in danger. The moment you made contact with him, you crossed a line. Do you understand? Dan's mind was spinning faster now. He had always known that there were powerful people in the world, people who held the fate of nations in their hands. but he had never imagined that he would be standing in front of one of them, let alone holding him. The stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. His eyes flicked back to Kim Jong-un, whose expression hadn't changed. The man still looked completely unaffected by the chaos around him. His smile had faded, but the calmness in his eyes remained. There was no fear. No sense of panic. Just cold, calculated composure. Dan's grip tightened on his radio. He had to make a decision, but he had no idea what the right one was. His mind raced through the possible consequences. What would happen if he just let the man go? What would happen if he didn't? The entire airport was in danger now. The world was in danger. "Sir," one of the security officers said, this time more firmly. "We need to evacuate the area. You need to step aside." Dan hesitated. He didn't want to step aside. He didn't want to back down. But as he looked at the fear in the eyes of the security officers around him, he realized something. They knew something he didn't. They had more information than he did. And it was clear now that whatever was happening, it was bigger than him. The realization hit him like a punch in the stomach. He had underestimated the man in front of him. He had thought he was just another criminal, just another person to take down. But now he understood the truth. This wasn't just about catching a criminal. This was about handling an international crisis, and Dan Carter was the last person who should be in charge of it. The security team moved in, closing ranks around Kim Jong-un. Dan stepped back, reluctantly allowing them to take over. But his eyes never left the man in the suit. Kim Jong-un's gaze locked with his for a moment, and in that instant, Dan could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. Kim Jong-un didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His eyes spoke volumes. And in that look, Dan saw something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't just amusement or cold indifference. No. There was something darker there, something that hinted at power, at control, at a mind capable of anything. As the security officers led Kim Jong-un away, Dan felt a wave of relief, but it was mixed with something else, something darker. He had just been part of something far bigger than he could ever have imagined. And he wasn't sure if he had done the right thing or not. The noise of the airport seemed to fade into the background as Dan stood there, trying to process everything that had just happened. His body was shaking, and his mind felt clouded. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was something else entirely. This was a moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had come face to face with the most dangerous man in the world, and he had no idea how to deal with the consequences. It didn't take long for the news to spread. It was like a wildfire, racing through the internet, television, and radio, reaching every corner of the world. Kim Jong-un had been at the airport, and Officer Dan Carter had tried to arrest him. At first, no one could believe it. The idea of a police officer from an airport in a small town in America confronting the leader of North Korea seemed almost impossible. But it had happened. And it had been caught on camera. The moment the news broke, chaos erupted everywhere. News stations scrambled to get details. Reporters spoke in fast, excited voices, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. In an unprecedented event, one newscaster said, a U.S. airport officer, Dan Carter, tried to detain Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader of North Korea, earlier today. The question remains, how did this happen? And what will be the consequences for the officer involved? The media was in a frenzy. They didn't have all the facts yet, but that didn't stop them from speculating. Some called it a mistake, others called it a bold act of heroism, but everyone agreed on one thing: it was a moment that would go down in history. The world had just witnessed a police officer face off against one of the most powerful and dangerous figures on the planet. The North Korean government was furious. Their anger boiled over in official statements, demanding answers. They wanted to know why one of their most important leaders had been treated like any other person in a line at the airport. They accused the United States of disrespecting their leader and causing an international crisis. Back in the United States, the government acted quickly. They didn't know what kind of political fallout they would face. Leaders from all sides of the government were having urgent meetings to figure out what to do. Should they apologize? Should they try to smooth things over? Or should they take a harder stance, risking further anger from North Korea? The White House issued a statement, urging calm. "We are looking into the situation and will ensure that the proper procedures are followed," the press secretary said. "Our relationship with North Korea is complex, but we must ensure that all parties act with respect for one another." The message was clear: this wasn't just a simple mistake. It was part of a bigger, more complicated issue. And they had to handle it carefully. Meanwhile, the world waited, breath held, wondering what would happen next. No one could deny that this was an enormous problem. The idea that a man like Kim Jong-un, someone with such power, could be treated like a criminal in an airport by an ordinary police officer was something no one could ignore. It was both shocking and terrifying. Back at the airport, Officer Dan Carter was pulled into a meeting with his superiors. The high-ranking officers had heard the news, and they were not happy. They sat in a small, dark room, their faces grim. It was clear that this wasn't just a normal discussion. This was about something far bigger than one small mistake. "Dan, you've been a good officer," one of the senior officers said, looking at Dan with a serious expression. "You've always done your job well. But this is a mess." Dan nodded, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "I didn't know who he was. He didn't look like anyone special. He didn't act like anyone special. I thought he was trying to hide something." "I know, Dan," the officer said. "We all understand that you were just doing your job. But you have to realize that what you did has consequences. You didn't just stop a regular traveler. You stopped the leader of North Korea. And now, the entire world is watching." Dan's heart sank. He had never wanted to be part of something so big, so dangerous. He had just been doing his job, trying to keep the airport safe. He didn't think he'd be the one responsible for starting an international incident. But that was exactly what had happened. And he couldn't take it back. In the days that followed, Dan's life began to unravel. The media didn't let up. Every news outlet wanted an interview. They wanted to know everything about the officer who had confronted Kim Jong-un. They wanted to know what he was thinking, what had gone through his mind in that moment. They wanted a story, and Dan was at the center of it. But Dan didn't want to be the center of attention. He just wanted this whole mess to end. He didn't know how he had ended up in this situation, but it was clear that he couldn't escape it. The airport reassigned him immediately. They didn't want to deal with the negative publicity. They didn't want to take any more risks. Dan was put on leave and told to stay quiet while the situation was sorted out. His career was hanging by a thread. He didn't know if he would ever work as a police officer again. The moment he touched Kim Jong-un had changed everything. But as the days passed, something unexpected happened. While Dan was no longer on active duty, the people around him started to speak up. The employees at the airport, the passengers who had witnessed the encounter, even some of the other officers, many of them began to praise him for what he had done. He had no idea who the guy was. He was just trying to do his job, one officer said in an interview. "I think he did the right thing. He followed his instincts. We can't let people like that walk through the airport like they're nobody." The passengers who had been there that day also began to speak out. "I saw what happened. That officer didn't know who he was dealing with. He just thought the guy was acting weird, like anyone would. But he stood up. He didn't back down. And for that, he deserves respect." Soon, the news outlets that had originally focused on the scandal began to change their tone. Some started to question the way Kim Jong-un was treated by his own government. Why was he allowed to travel so casually, without proper security, especially after everything he had done? Wasn't it strange that such a dangerous figure could just walk into an airport, unnoticed, without anyone knowing who he was? Dan's case sparked a conversation. It made people think about the role of everyday officers in protecting the public, even when they don't know the full picture. And in a way, it made people realize how fragile the balance of power could be. One small mistake, one moment of action, and everything could change. Eventually, the situation was handled, and Kim Jong-un's representatives came to an agreement with the United States government. The incident was brushed aside diplomatically, and tensions began to cool. But for Dan, the fallout was not over. His reassignment led to a long period of reflection. In the end, he was not charged with anything, and he wasn't dismissed from the force. However, his career never truly recovered. He stayed in a less visible position, far from the spotlight, but he knew he would never forget that moment at the airport. Dan had made a mistake, but he had also done his best. He had followed his instincts, even if it had led him into a dangerous situation. And although the consequences had been severe, he could hold his head high knowing that he had tried to do the right thing in a world where it was all too easy to do nothing. As for Kim Jong-un, the world moved on. The incident faded into history, a strange chapter in the complex story of international politics. But for Dan Carter, it would remain a moment that defined him. Reflection. Sometimes, in life, we find ourselves caught up in things we don't understand. Things bigger than ourselves. And we have to make decisions, sometimes on the fly, that change everything. The truth is, no one ever knows how they'll react in a moment like that. But it's what we do afterward that really matters. Dan Carter learned that the hard way. But even in the face of fear, pressure, and uncertainty, he had stayed true to who he was. And for that, he had earned something far more valuable than any badge or title: respect. Sometimes, the most ordinary moment can be the turning point in your life. A quiet moment, unnoticed by most, can be the one that changes everything. For Officer Dan Carter, it was a routine check at the airport. He had no way of knowing that it would spiral into international chaos. What started as a simple action, a firm hand on an arm, ended up altering the course of his life forever. One moment, everything was normal, and the next, he found himself at the center of a world-changing event. For Kim Jong-un, on the other hand, it was just another day. To him, the events that unfolded at the airport were nothing more than a small inconvenience. The leader of North Korea was used to being underestimated, used to people not recognizing him for who he really was. He had grown accustomed to moving through life with an air of calm, always playing his role as the powerful figure no one dared challenge. But that day, he was wrong. That day, someone dared to challenge him. And in that one moment, Officer Carter proved that appearances can be deceiving. The world can never fully know what will happen when two people, seemingly ordinary in their own ways, collide. Carter had no idea who he was dealing with, but his instinct told him something was off. His decision to act, to take control of the situation, was a split-second choice, but it set off a chain of events that rippled through the globe. That is the truth about life: you never know when you might face a turning point, when you might be called to make a decision that feels small but carries enormous weight. What seems like an ordinary moment can be a life-changing one. And sometimes, the people we least expect to make an impact are the ones who surprise us the most. There are moments in our lives when we feel like we're invisible, when the world doesn't seem to notice us or take us seriously. It's easy to think that we're just one person in a crowd, lost among millions of others. But what Officer Carter's story teaches us is that sometimes, being unnoticed can be the most powerful thing of all. It is in those moments when we least expect it that we find the strength to rise, to take action, and to shape the course of our lives. Think about it. Carter wasn't a world leader. He wasn't someone with power or influence. He was a cop, doing his job, walking through the crowded airport. But in that moment, when he made his decision, he wasn't just a cop. He was the one who stood up when no one else did. He was the one who took a risk, who reached out and grabbed hold of something bigger than himself, and in doing so, he changed his life and the lives of countless others. It's the same for all of us. Life doesn't always give us grand moments, moments that are dramatic or full of fireworks. Often, it's the small, everyday moments that carry the greatest weight. It's in the choices we make, the steps we take, that we can change the world around us. We may not always see the outcome of those decisions right away, but they matter. They shape who we are and who we become. And just like Kim Jong-un, who underestimated Officer Carter, we too can underestimate those around us. We can look at someone and think we know them, but there is always more beneath the surface. Every person you meet has a story, a life, and a journey of their own. Everyone has the potential to surprise you. And it's important to remember that no one is truly invisible. In life, there will always be those who stand on the sidelines, watching others take charge, afraid to act. They wait for the perfect moment, the right time, but by then, the world may have moved on. The truth is, there's no such thing as a perfect moment. There is only now. There is only this moment, this very second, and the choice you make. Don't wait for the world to give you permission to act. Don't wait for the stars to align or for someone else to take the first step. Be the one who steps forward, who takes control, who dares to do something unexpected. You never know what impact your actions will have. Carter's moment of bravery didn't come with a guarantee of success. He didn't know that his action would lead to the kind of international fallout that followed. But he did it because, in that moment, he believed it was the right thing to do. And that belief is what carried him through. Sometimes, doing the right thing isn't easy. Sometimes, it doesn't bring immediate rewards. Sometimes, it brings confusion, frustration, or consequences we weren't expecting. But it always brings something: growth, strength, a deeper understanding of ourselves. And isn't that what really matters? In a world where it's easy to get lost in the noise, it's important to remember that our choices, small as they may seem, are what define us. It's the quiet moments, the ones where we make decisions based on what we believe to be right, that shape who we are and who we become. We don't always get to choose the path we take, but we always get to choose how we walk it. And in the end, it's not about being remembered for the big, dramatic moments. It's about being remembered for the quiet, powerful actions we take when no one is looking. It's about staying true to our values, our beliefs, and our sense of what is right, even when the world is watching. There is power in the unexpected. And there is beauty in the moments that surprise us, in the ways that life can twist and turn when we least expect it. Sometimes, it's the smallest, most ordinary moment that can reveal the most about us. And that, in itself, is the greatest lesson. So, the next time you find yourself standing in an ordinary place, doing something you think is small or insignificant, remember this: you never know when the turning point will come. You never know when the world will change around you, when someone you meet will surprise you, or when you will surprise yourself.